Okay, well, thanks everybody for inviting us to come and speak to today. So there's obviously Hilary, who's well-known ecologist around the area, and I'm sort of more involved with the butterfly side of the park, and also just doing the physical management of the hedge laying, the scything, the coppicing, and the and things like that. So you know, it's a great site for all sorts of creatures, really. You know, bees, hoverflies, spiders, moths, and of course butterflies. And I hope some of you can come to the site. Those are local. We're having a site visit on the 28th of February of May. So hopefully you can make it then. It's a Cheshire Wildlife Trust Reserve. It's unique that it's got its own committee that runs the reserve. So that's really quite good. So it's more hands-on. I mean, they want to be one of many of their reserves. We can manage it all ourselves, really. So it's all run by volunteers. About 50 volunteers who are involved in the site. So it's a popular reserve in New Ferry. It's become a bit of a logo for the local area. And we're doing a lot of management for butterflies, but a lot of the management is also good for a whole range of invertebrates. You know, the more biodiversity you have, the more niches you have for all sorts of invertebrates. So, you know, we've got 19 species of butterfly breeding at the site. I think we've got 26 recorded. So in each species has different requirements at different times of the year. Say if you're brimstone now, you'd be using you know, you'd be looking for use primroses and things, and a month later bluebells, and late on the year you'd be using hawkweed or red campion. So each one has different things, and also each stage is a little thing. I mean, here we've got at the bottom of the screen, we've got a ladybird larvae and a ladybird, and they're both eating sort of similar diet of aphids and things. But if you think of butterflies, they're quite different. You know, the caterpillars are eating leaves, restricted to a few larval food plants, because there's no advantage to be eaten by a hungry caterpillar, really. So they're very, very restricted. And when in the adult form, obviously they're just taking nectar and pollen. So you know, so a completely different life form. And because of the pollinating, there's obviously it's advantage to the flowers of pollinating. They have a much larger host of plants as adults that they use. But we've got even more invertebrates, really. Although we've got 26 species of butterfly, we've got 36 species of spider, and that's because we know somebody called John McGaw who can identify them. That's an issue now of identifying all these things. But we do have over 200 species of invertebrate, and that's because we've had groups coming along, like yourselves, and come along and identify things that we possibly couldn't. I mean, there's no way we can be an expert on all these groups. So we know we've been setting back the ecological clock here at Butterfly Park to try and maintain its biodiversity. If we just left it, it would have changed. And since we've had the site, it's been colonised by a few butterflies naturally. So there's orange chips, they come from nearby Dimmesdale, and we've had some brimstones. We've had some other, and they moved in, and we've also had purple hair streaks. And recently had an Essex skipper, so that's a national trend of them moving forwards. You know, so that's showing that we've got some the right type of grass habitats suitable for skippers. So that's the rougher type of grasslands. So here, we've got a picture of the site in the 1960s. Thanks. So here's a picture of the site in the 1960s, and that embankment there is where the Butterfly Park. We've got the large tower in the centre of the picture, and that's a water softening tower. So that was used to take calcium out of the water, clean it up, and it was pumped. Then it was pumped to Birkenhead for the steam engines. And all that calcium it's took out, they poured onto a field. So that gave us a nice calcareous grassland, nice nutrient poor calcareous grassland. And other parts we have acid grasslands. And we've also got thin railway ballasts. So that's a picture of the site in 1964. It was abandoned. So yeah, we've got, I think, got a picture of the site, Hilary? Yeah. So one of the things when you're looking for you know, what to do with the site, you might think you've first got to find out what's there. So that's quite complicated, really, because obviously these type of creatures like this comma here, butterflies are easy to identify. Perhaps bees not so bad, and dragonflies and things. But there's all sorts of other groups, in which macro moths not too bad, but there's all these smaller groups of micro moths and all sorts of deadwood insects, which are really quite hard to identify, and you have to get people involved. So see what you've got. If you've got nutrient poor grasslands, don't go planting trees on them, because it takes such a long time to take the nutrients out of the grasslands. So it's important to you know, survey. We had people want to plant on meadows and, you know, ruin it, really. So it's sort of important to try and see what you've got, and then what you can do with the things you've already got. I mean, like we've made most of our calcareous grasslands and some of our railway features there. So that's what you've got to just see what you've got before you launch into things. So it's a bit of time to survey and things like that. So I think we've got a little map of the site. So this is a little map of the site just to show you. It's a long southwest facing site. It's got quite a lot of diversity in a small site. We've got 2 ponds. So one's an open focal pond dominated by newts. Another one is pit pond. It's a bit more nutrient rich. It's been filled in, but that seems to be dominated by frogs. And obviously you have a whole range of butterflies. Most of them are just fairly easy to recognize and see, apart from things like the white hair streak, which are up in the canopy. So they're a bit harder to actually spot those butterflies. And of course, we've got a whole pile of grasshoppers and a full range of bumblebees and solitary wasps and things. So it just gives you a small. It's about 50 meters wide. The site. So it's quite a narrow site, but quite a lot of biodiversity in a small little spot. Next slide, is it? Okay, that's just to say we've got these open mosaics of habitats. So there's quite a lot of small habitats quite close to each other. So that's quite, you think of the larvae of many creatures, they're not going to crawl very far. Take a peacock butterfly. The larvae aren't only going to crawl a few meters. After they've been using the nettles, and they'll crawl a few meters to a hedgerow or a woodland margin to use that. So it's quite good. We've got all these habitats quite close together, and we'll go through and show a few of these habitats as we move along through the presentation.
Which point I take over. All these different invertebrates, yes, they all have slightly different requirements, but fortunately it is possible to group them in some ways and therefore cater for a lot of different things in the same site. They're animals, so they all need food. And for an awful lot of invertebrates, that's plant food, living or dead. Don't neglect the dead food field chain. They need shelter for hibernation and indeed for when the weather decides to pour with rain in June. They need some specialist breeding facilities for quite a lot of species. And many invertebrates appreciate bare ground, either to warm up or to hunt on like wolf spiders, or even for nesting in, for some, the mining bees, for instance. For food, variety of plants, native or what we call near natives, so related to our native plants, tend to support the most. And usually a variety of plants will give you niches for a variety of invertebrates. There are, of course, as always in biology, exceptions. The reed marshes are dominated by one plant species, but are rich in invertebrates. For a lot of insects, as opposed to wider invertebrates, some stage in the life cycle needs nectar and pollen. Nectar for energy and pollen for protein. And for that reason, it's very important to have a continuity of nectar and pollen available from March to September. Some species, it just takes a long time to rear the nest. So the queen bumblebees are out now. They will not have the new queens and males out till July. And then the females feed up to hibernate. So if there's any gaps in the nectar and pollen provision during that time, the nest may well fail. Other species, like many of the solitary bees, are out just for a limited time and they've got to have the nectar and pollen in that slot. So Butterfly Park, at this point, the cowslips are just coming out. Any of the Primula family are jolly good for early nectar. Don't forget the trees and shrubs. In fact, the common sallow and the goat willow, the two pussy willows, are vital for bumblebees. They're one of the first trees and shrubs into flower, separate male and female trees, of course. And they're very useful, particularly the bumblebees use the pollen to get enough protein to lay the first eggs. That's hawthorn. Nice open flat flower, can be used by any insect that needs nectar and pollen. And that's true of a lot of the rest of the hedgerow shrubs, a lot of which are rose family. Moving on from that to the late May, early June slot. Now, this is where the rural area often has completely lost its flowers. It's the slot where the traditional hay meadows used to flower. And of course, 97, 98% of the traditional hay meadows have gone in the last 60 years. The creature, by the way, is a thick-legged flower beetle, or a swollen-thighed flower beetle. So the late May, early June slot, if our urban sites can provide nectar and pollen in that, that is a very useful link in it. And the oxides, easy to grow, just happen to fit in that one. A little bit later in June on the line waste here, the orchids we didn't plant. Orchids are one of those species which, if you've got the right soil and the right fungus, they'll come, and if you haven't, they won't. So there's very little point in trying to transplant them. The yellow is one of the many dandelion lookalikes that drive trainee botanists mad. It's rough hawkbit. All of the dandelion and their lookalikes are good nectar and pollen plants. So this time of year, don't weed the dandelions out of your allotment or your garden. Let them flower. Down the left-hand corner, there's some swollen seed pods of yellow rattle or hay rattle. Often, given marvelous powers by people, they say it's a meadow maker. Well, it isn't, but it helps. It's a good bee flower, the bees like it, but it is semi-parasitic on other plants, particularly grasses, though actually quite a wide range. It doesn't attack the very big grasses, though, not the cocksfoots and false oats of the world, but it will keep the grass down in a mixed meadow like this, and therefore give more space for the wildflowers to thrive. The pea family are very important. Because they fix their own nitrogen, their pollen is particularly rich in protein. The bumblebees love the red clover. So always well worth fostering some legumes. And then right the way through the summer, that's ending up on a Michaelmas daisy with the red admiral feeding up to hibernate as an adult. Michaelmas daisy, of course, is not native, but it's another of this group that we call near natives, which some research work at Sheffield has shown will support quite a large number of native species, particularly as nectar and pollen sources, not necessarily the leaf-eating stages. One of the very best of the late season plants is ivy. But ivy can be a problem. We've lost 2 trees to storms on the park this year, which were heavily ivy hung, and I suspect that hastened their falling over. Ivy is now growing more and faster with these merry mild winters. And so there has to be a bit of a balance between controlling it if it's on exposed trees where there's a risk it's going to help bring the tree over, and keeping it particularly in sunny spots where it can climb and flower as a very good late nectar source. And then, of course, in February, a berry source for the bees. Paul.
Yeah, so another important resource of food supply for invertebrates or deadwood habitat piles. So here's a large one here. So they may be used by, say, peacock butterflies, may sort of just hibernate there over the winter because they need somewhere to hibernate over the winter. And we've got all sorts of deadwood invertebrates at the park, that we would use that sort of stuff. So here's a little example for people. And you can get it in a mixture of places of either in shade, some of it in sun, some of it in shade, maybe some of it in damp areas or and water if you got, because you'll get a different type of fauna from that spot there. So it's important. I mean, the deadwood piles rot from the outside in, as opposed to standing deadwood. We'll see a bit more later, goes the other way around, rots from the inside out, makes a little hollow tube. So you do get sort of different types of flora and fauna there. So it's standing upright and stuff is good. So it's another important resource to have at the park, just give continuity deadwood. So we're always topping up some of these piles. So we're always doing processing some wood. We'll chip some, but we'll also be topping this up, feeding them all the time. So, and then this is a basking area. This is the old New Ferry platform, which we moved. And we're using that as a nice sort of basking area. And the road itself is a really good basking area. So we'll get creatures in there, and then get spiders going underneath those large flagstones. There's quite a nice community there. It's getting nice and warm, and the invertebrates want to warm up and get going. Like ourselves, we need quite a good temperature to get going, really. So it's a good example of that. And then there's a nice dry bank behind of vegetation. So that's sort of another dry area there. So it's important to have basking sites, and we've created some other basking sites of old paving stones. So maybe you can have a look at that when you come. Some neighbours have thrown paving stones over. We've made a branch that made a crescent-shaped sort of structure and we've added a bit of lime to it to get some colonization flowers and hopefully form a nice dry bank for butterflies and other invertebrates to enjoy. This is tussock grass, really quite important. It's important for the skippers, for instance, because they lay their eggs in the old seed heads from the year before. They also form little microclimates around in the around in the base. So it's obviously quite different from other things. So this also, we have our other grassland butterflies as well as the skippers. We've got the meadow browns and speckled woods. So if you cut all that grass to the park, you definitely would destroy some of the invertebrates. So it's important overwintering sites, and often the bees are around the bases of these trees doing nests and things. So it's another important. It's a bit of a balance to keep the tussock grass, because if you don't cut it, could seek to bramble and blackthorn, and if you, so it's a bit of a balance of cutting it. Maybe you might cut it some areas a third each year just to maintain it. Oh, and this is one thing we've done at the park is I've planted hedgerows. So again, as Hilary mentioned, we have a sequence of different shrubs. You know, from hazel hazel comes along, flowers early and it's used by the honeybees, and blackthorn and things like that. So we have a whole series of shrubs there. We've been able to take advantage in some urban environments to on the calcareous soils, we've been able to put some other shrubs such as privet and spindle and things like that. So we've been able to do a bit of variety there. And then also you can get maybe some curves in your hedgerows or little spikes just to break up the wind again, because it does make a big difference to the park. At the entrance it's quite cold, you get behind the trees and you can suddenly feel it's a lot warmer. So we've had a whole variety there. And also we've put some banks in, so we've dug a ditch and we put a bank up. So that was quite good for the solitary bees going into that bank there. And we've also added some more wildflowers. There's, stitchwort, red campion, and primroses and things like that to expand the nectar sources. And here we have the volunteers in the hedge lane. They sort of love hedge lane. So that's where you're cutting the hedge, bending it over, and you're retaining some of the, maybe 30% of the flowers, I suppose. If you flailed it all or cut it all, you'd lose them all. So there you are. We're cutting, bending over, making it very good for birds, and we're just getting it. We're keeping the flowers. Of course, you have the flowers, which the insects do, and later on in the year, you have the berries, which the birds use. So it's a really good habitat. It's like a woodland edge habitat, so it's nice to increase that. It's the best of both worlds, of the grassland and the woodland habitat. And of course, next to the hedges, we often keep a wide verge of taller grasses. So we're going from maybe mown grasses to a verge of tussocky grasses and then up to the hedgerow. So we've got that nice little ecotone there. This is an example of some of the key plants. Obviously, nettles. They're pretty good for these are peacock. Well, it was a nettle. It's been well eaten by peacock butterflies. So this is one of the few plants we're feeding. Actually, we actually give it the volunteers have a barbecue. Some of the cold ashes are put on to feed it. So a lot of times we're trying to reduce nutrients, but not for the nettles. We're trying to feed them. So you get tortoise shells using them, and you also get comma and using them, and red admirals. They're more as singletons of those. And there's 28 species of moth which use the nettles. That's really quite good. So about 80 restricted to them. So they're really good out in a sunny out in a sunny area. Perhaps with a bit of hedgerow, because obviously these will when these pupate, there's no nettle left. They've eaten it all, so they climb off. They crawl onto another area. You need to climb about 1 meter high and then pupate there. So you do need something next to the nettles to give them a bit of shelter. Next one, Hilary. So this is bird's foot trefoil, which is a great plant. It really is a great plant for all sorts of invertebrates. I think there's 33 butterflies which use it, and I think we have a male blue butterfly and the burnet moth here. Both uses it. The burnet moth's got the little red warning signs on it because it's probably picked up a bit of cyanide from the bird's foot trefoil as it's been eating it. Bird's foot trefoil, because it's sometimes damaged, produces a bit of cyanide to protect itself. And up above you can see carpets of bird's foot trefoil, which we tried to maintain really. So it's a great plant. Fixes nitrogen, of course, with a symbiosis with the bacteria. It gives the bacteria carbohydrates, and the carbohydrates gives it fixed nitrogen. So that's the problem is it suddenly increases its own fertility. And then here's another plant. This is just a little breeding success we had with a Brimstone butterflies. So there were no breeding on the Wirral Brimstone butterflies, and we planted some older buckthorn quite a long time ago in about 2003. We saw a few singletons, and then I think in 2014 we actually got them breeding on site. As you can see there, one just above that ruler, 2 or 3 centimeters. It's sort of again, it's stripped that older buckthorn. There's the adult form, nectarine and red valerian, probably by one of the walls. And then we also record the butterflies. You can either just do records, or you can go to an ad hoc basis, or you could do. We do have a more formalized transect, but that requires somebody who can dive in the week whenever it's a good day in that week. So there's quite a commitment to do that. So we're quite grateful we've got somebody who's doing the transect now. And of course, there's when we're looking at the larvae, you can see a larvae there on a purging buckthorn, and it's been eaten by a bronze shield bug. So I never noticed a bronze shield bug, but I wasn't looking at the larvae there. So it helps some invertebrates and it helps some other invertebrates. So it's it's a whole ecosystem of support in there. Next one, Hilary. This is an old Hawthorn Trunk. Again, you can see it's nice and hollow there. So again, creatures would hibernate inside there. So it's rotted from the outside, from the inside out. And you can see all these little exit holes there for various creatures we get there. And here's a creature we found there. It's like one of the longhorn beetles. That'll eat the dead wood, and as it comes out, it will use things like hogweed, angelica, or hawthorn. So it's important to have that continuity of dead wood, which is quite an important issue. So we have also been pollarding some trees. We want some of the trees to be too big, so we're keeping the trunk. So we're building that large trunk, which will hopefully form the dead wood of the future. Because obviously, to get that old bit of hawthorn there, you have to wait 150 years. So it is important to try and
Paul seems to have frozen. Yes, Paul seems to have frozen. Right, well, fortunately, I can pick up at that point anyway. The other thing is bare ground. And this is towards the end of our old access road. And you can see the painted lady butterfly flat to the ground, warming itself up. And bare ground is very important for, as I said before, for basking, for warming up, but also for something like wolf spiders. And it's the easiest thing to lose is bare ground. You have to make efforts to keep it on the long term. So how do you get this sort of open flowery grassland with lots of wildflowers? Well, you want a very infertile soil. So soils that are low in plant nutrients, especially phosphate. That's because legumes need phosphate to fix nitrogen via the bacteria in their roots. So if the phosphate's high, you get legumes like white clover, which fix an awful lot of nitrogen, and the fertility steadily climbs. If you've got low phosphate, then it's restricted to legumes like the bird's foot trefoil there, bacon and eggs, which are much slower to fix nitrogen. It's much less quantity. The rain puts in about 30 kilograms per hectare nitrogen per year, which is a low fertilizer dose. That's from our pollution, from our vehicles and so forth. So it is a constant battle to keep low fertility soils. If you've got an area of low fertility, please don't put topsoil on it. Please don't put fertilizer on it. Please don't tree plant it or even dig a pond. It's a very valuable resource to have low fertility soils. That's the siding area at the Butterfly Park. So that's the railway ballast underneath that. And being a 1900 goods yard, it was whatever was gritty and free draining they could lay hands on, not the posh limestone ballast from the main line next door. So it's about pH 7, it's about neutral. Waste materials can be a very good way of getting a low fertility soil. I'm standing on Port Sunlight River Park. So underneath my feet, when I took that picture, there were 37 metres of the rubbish from Wirral and Liverpool. It's now open as a public park with the Land Trust managing it, with TCV doing a lot of practical work this year. The upper part of the area was nominally topsoiled in 2012. Well, I took a landscape architect I was there with about a year or so later, and he looked around, it was still mostly bare at the time, and said, how haven't seen any topsoil yet. Building rubble with a little bit of topsoil mixed in, which is more or less what it is. That has its disadvantages. There's so many lumps of big concrete and brick and stuff, and so many bits of metal from reinforced concrete sticking up. They can't mow it, which is a long-term management problem. On the other hand, the soil is calcareous and low in nutrients. Calcareous soils are normally low in phosphate because it complexes with the phosphates and makes it to an insoluble or very poorly soluble form. So this has developed an interesting flora. All sorts of things that arrived from the bits of soil that are in it, from what blew in, what's come from the docks next door. This bit actually did have a wildflower mix put on it, hence all the oxidazes. The blue is Viper's bugloss, the yellow is kidney vetch. Yeah, there is a little bit of white clover in the foreground, but not enough to be a problem. And there are little bits of bare ground, as you can see, in through it. So if you've got, crushed concrete garage or building rubble or something or other on an area, again, that's the place to have your wildflower mix. Don't, whatever you do, raise the fertility. Extreme pHs restrict fertility by themselves because they restrict nutrient availability. The photo on the left is on the lime waste, as the orchids were earlier, left behind from that water treatment works that filtered the water for the steam engines. And it's particularly calcareous. The purple is betony, which we planted in the original plants, but it's now spreading. There's more yellow rattle in there and hawkweeds and so on and so forth. The right-hand picture is acid, slightly acid grassland, only about pH 6, where the coal trucks used to tip up and tip their coal onto the ground. Obviously, bits of coal got all over the track bed. And that has left us with a slightly acid grassland, lower fertility again. The knapweeds love it, as you can see. And the yellow is garden escape goldenrod. Again, one of these near natives, relations of a native species, but come from Canada. A very good late summer nectar plant, and we don't find it invasive in those conditions. So this area is very much our late summer nectar area, August, September. Whoopsie daisy, our Paul's coming back in, and for some reason my screen is frozen and won't let me show the next picture. Now it does, that's all right then. Drought. This is on the end of the Butterfly Park access road with some rather broken tarmac and cracks in it and holes in it. It's a classic primary succession. It starts off with moss, and then into that, various other plants seed themselves. They're growing on about 1 centimetre of soil. Birdfoot trefoil again, oxidazes again, hawkweeds of various sorts. And you can see that the oxidazes are barely any taller than the bacon and eggs, the birdfoot trefoil, because of drought. So drought can be a very useful thing in keeping the plants low, bare ground again, good nectar sources, keeps the grass out mostly, a few annual grasses in it. And when it gets a bit dense or we want some of the road back to park on, we just roll it all up like a carpet, take it off and compost it. Further up the sidings, we do something a bit unusual. Gradually, the siding area tends to get more dense, more grasses in it, or get invaded by quite a lot of birch trees. When it gets to that stage, we clear a patch, usually one each year, about 10 metre by 10 metre, so 100 square metre. Only they're never square, they're funny shapes to fit the land. And we just take off the vegetation and the root mat back to the ballast underneath, and then leave it. And the vegetation comes back from root fragments and things like birdfoot trefoil, from seeding in. That's hop trefoil in the middle, which is seeded in. And you get, again, this warm vegetation, short. So caterpillars feeding on it grow fast because of the warmth. Bare ground patches in it for the adults to bask and the wolf spiders to run around. We do cut part of this annually. The other part, for various practical reasons of difficulty, we don't. But we do this stripping on something like a 10 to 12 year cycle, but it does depend on the particular patch, how often it needs doing. So that is an unusual technique which will work where you've got something solid underneath which you can go back to. We've done it on parts of the lime waste as well. On clay, you need patience. This is on what we think is probably the natural clay for the area, the boulder clay. Doesn't seem to be used for anything much when the Goodyard was active, probably had the horses hobbled on it. And since at least 1998, but probably a year or two before that, 1998 is the first detailed management plan we wrote, and we've been cutting this twice a year, taking the cuttings off and composting them. So it gets cut in, some of it late July, the rest in September, and that's the long vegetation that gets cleared off. And it gets a second cut with the motor mower at the end of April, so because we use it as the place for all our stalls at the big opening day at the beginning of May, 1st of May this year. Over that time, it has gradually changed from tussock grasses of cocksfoot and false oat and so forth to the moderately mixed sward you see there, with lots of buttercups, lots of red clover, sprinkling of other things. There's goat's beard and plantain and hogweed. And it forms a useful nectar and pollen source for the midsummer and time, June, July, into the beginning of August for part of it. But it does need patience. And of course, this is a clay which has not been in agricultural use since around 1900 when the Goodyard is built, and so has never had modern artificial fertilizers on it. Much harder if you're trying to convert an agricultural clay, although on lighter soils, sands, calcareous ones, removing the gut vegetation will reduce the nutrients more quickly because nutrients leach out as well. Clay is very good at holding on to nutrients. Paul, you're back. Good.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened. So this is obviously cutting grasslands will damage any of the invertebrate flora that you have. So it's always that dilemma. Because if you don't cut the grasslands, some of the plants they rely on will disappear. So this is a little map of the park, and we try and cut as late as possible. But we're just doing small patches of coppicing of sizing really. Probably about 200 square meters. You know, that takes about 3 volunteers with size and a 3 volunteer raking up really to do it. And we follow a little regime every year, so it's quite important to stick to the same regime. So we start from the light blue area, which is near the pond and things, and that will benefit the lady smock plant particularly, obviously, which we want for the orange tip butterflies. So that's sort of, but the plants will adapt if you keep, we keep on, we're doing it. I said, Hilary said, some of these we've been doing since '98, and we've been slowly expanding our mowing regime as we've got a bit better at mowing, and also as the grass height has reduced, there's been less stuff material to take off, so that's been quite important. So we start off around the pond area, then we go to that clay, the dark blue area with the clay area Hilary was talking about with the clover, which you've seen. And then we go on that yellow area, which is all full of the cowslips, which you saw earlier. So we're cutting that quite late. We're doing because it's quite nutrient poor. We've been able to get away with that's cut in October, so it's quite a late cut. But because it's already nutrient poor soils, because we did scrape off a bit of the vegetation originally to get back to the calcium, we're doing quite well. I think we're cutting that in October, and we've still got lots of cowslips in March. It's doing quite well. And then we've got a few other little grasslands, the acid grasslands and the coals, which we scythe much later, sort of November, December time, because in October we've still got small coppers flying, so there'll be things on the Michaelmas daisy and things like that. So we have a little flurry of them. So that's why that's cut so low, so late in the season. And we have to compost it all. I think that's what it looks like. Oh, there's a scything there. You might recognise 2 people there involved with scything. So there's the scythes there, and of course the most important thing is to take the cuttings off. So there's a little trolley there that's made it much easier to do all the scything. And so as we scythe, the grass is going a little less every year. It has reduced, and the flora and fauna has changed. And as you scythe throughout the season, it starts off quite nice in July and gets worse as the season. It gets harder to cut as the grass starts falling over. And here we have a compost heap, so we're doing lots of composting. It's getting much better than that now, as we've got more things like clover in the mixture that's helping, because there wasn't enough. It was too much carbon really in the mixture, just grasses. And now it's sort of it's moving along quite nicely, and we do some what we call use the liquid gold from the composting lutefic as an accelerant to get the compost going. And this is exporting nutrients out of the park really, because then we ask people for donations and they come and collect it. We sell it as soil improver to the local allotment societies. So yeah, it's just to show. Oh, you have people siding to show you how it looks over the year. We've seen some of these photographs of the cowslips there, the rougher grassland with the skippers and the laid hedge behind there. So we can see that sort of. Sometimes the siders don't always see what they're doing if they come in the summer. So it's always good to have a few photographs to show them what they're doing. So it looks quite different from when we're mowing it in the spring. It's quite good.
Well, what do you do if what you've got is a typical amenity grassland, which is moderately fertile because most amenity grasslands, the grass is cut and left on to rot in, and you've got that nitrogen coming down in the rain as well. And it's the typical amenity grassland of ryegrass and meadowgrass and not an awful lot else. Well, of course, it is possible to sow wildflower grasslands. I hesitate to call them meadows because recreating a traditional meadow is a work of centuries, not of a couple of seasons, but certainly useful wildflower areas. This is Puddydale at Heswall, where small public park on a fairly sandy clay, where Heswall's Rotary Environment Group has created a wildflower area with my advice. What we've done there is to turf strip the grass and the root mat. That takes off quite a lot of nutrients. And but it's still topsoil underneath. You don't strip it deep to lose the topsoil. It's just the root mat itself. And so that can be cultivated and make a reasonable seed bed. And then simply sown with a wildflower seed mix. Now you may be able to hand collect stuff. You may be able to get green hay from a remaining few wildflower meadows if you're lucky, but in most urban areas, that's not a practicality. And of course, there are good reputable firms who will supply wildflower mixes of various sorts. Well, down the left-hand corner, there's a oxeye daisy coming up, and in the middle, there's a sorrel on its way. You may notice there's almost no grass. That one little bit put itself in. 20 years ago, we were sowing wildflowers mixes with 80% grass, 20% wildflowers, because that's roughly what a traditional meadow ends up like. Then Landlife and others realized you actually got a lot better results if you sowed just the wildflower seed mix and left the grasses to come in by themselves. You might sow a bit of some unusual grasses like crested dog's tail or sweet vernal grass that aren't in the local area, but it's amazing how soon grass puts itself in. Both the Nest Gardens wildflower area and the Chester Zoo Nature Reserve were done by just sowing the wildflowers. Now, there are times when it's necessary to put some grass in if you're on a steep slope and erosion's a problem. It's also in a public park. It can be very good to have something that will give you the first year colour. So most of what you can see there is corn chamomile and corn cockle. There's Cornfield Annuals, which a few months later look like that. Now that's a lovely nectar and pollen source. But Cornfield Annuals, the clue's in the name. They're the annuals from the corn, and they need annual ploughing and harrowing to keep other plants out and to stimulate their seed to germinate. And of course, you can't do that if you've got perennial wildflowers you're trying to get through as well. So although they're good as a nurse crop, if you want to keep Cornfield Annuals every year, you've got to have a patch you cultivate every year, and that's quite hard work. But on the wildflower meadows like this, Nest did put the Cornfield Annuals in, the zoo decided not to. Do need a lot of good interpretation if you're going to put them in to say to people it'll look like that first year, and a bit like that second year, because it takes them a while to fade down. And then it'll change quite a lot by third year as the perennials start to come up and the grasses have got themselves in. And there'll actually be a lot less flower for a year or two, and then the perennials hopefully really get going. And it gradually gets more flowery and over a longer period. If you've got a sward which has got a reasonable number of things in it, so you don't want to strip and start again, but you want to add to it, then you can plant things in. Now, same thing here, just using a spade, took off the grass and the root mat from it. That's about the smallest possible size. It's only about a foot square. I prefer 1/2 metre square. And then plant in small plants and plugs into that. The clearance gives them a few weeks, few months to get themselves established before the grass grows back in again. Make up the level with a bit of wood chip if need be. You can buy plants and plugs, of course, but you could also grow them up quite easily from wildflower seed that you've collected in the local area or bought in. Quite a lot of wildflowers, the seed needs what we call vernalization. So it needs a cold treatment over winter. so it knows when spring's come. So mix the seed with damp sand or damp compost, pop it outside somewhere with a net or something over to stop the birds and the mice eating them, and leave it over winter. And then this time of year say, oh, I better go and look at those and find they're all germinating and need potting on. And they can be planted out once they've got 4 to 6 true leaves. Of course, before you start on any of this, it does need a good survey to make sure what you've got, but also make sure your management is in place, particularly machines or scythers who will cope with cutting the long grass and preferably taking it off. Can chop it up small and leave it on, but it's not that, the fertility builds if you do that. We've used this technique of planting in for particular things on the butterfly park, especially for the small coppers. Now that's a small copper in the top left. Its food plants are sorrels, common sorrel and sheep sorrel, but it much prefers the sheep sorrel. The best rural population is on Royal Liverpool Golf Course, where the leached sand of the roughs has got a lot of sheep sorrel on it. They lay the eggs, those little white things, very pretty if you get magnifying glass to it. The caterpillar looks like a woodlouse, except it's got pink stripes. The pupa, the bottom left, like many butterfly moth pupae, is in the top layers of the soil, in the litter, among some wood chip, under long grass, under trees and shrubs. So it does need this continent in habitats next door to each other, this mosaic, so that that larva can move from the food plants into somewhere it's suitable to pupate. Well, sheep sorrel is a real acid soil species. And we've got that small area where we'd got the coal had been tipped, which was fairly acid, but the rest of the siding wasn't as acid. So we thought we'd acidify it. So we got a grant and we bought a lorry load of coal dust. Actually, Nest and Coal Yard were so glad to get rid of all their sweepings, they gave it to us. We also put some agricultural sulfur, top right-hand picture, you can see the yellow on parts of it. And bottom left-hand corner, you can see that in the first year, it did look a little bit strange, although all that dark area was a lovely basking site. And we planted in some sheep sorrel plants to boost the small population we'd got naturally on the acid area next door. And that middle picture at the bottom, if you pick out all the red bits, that's the sheep sorrel flowering. So there's actually quite a lot in there and bits of bare ground for the basking. So that has been successful. It has increased the small copper quite a bit, and actually because it's lowered the fertility of that siding area even more, and it's now scythed once a year and cleared off. There's quite a variety of nectar plants on there now. There's birchwood's trefoil and there's knapweeds and so on and so forth. So it is a good nectar and pollen area for other species. And this is one for only big sites. Soil inversion. It's what was done at Nest Gardens on the Wildflower area. A great big plough turns the whole soil profile upside down for somewhere between 1/2 metre and 1 metre, burying the fertile layers at the bottom. This was a carrot field before it was done. This is on at Alvanley, just outside Alvanley on the Frodsham Ridge, a woodland trust site called Wealdon Copse. Landlife did a lot of research work on this technique before they went bust. And I gather the big ploughs can still be found. Talked to Richard Scott at the Eden Project. It only works on light soils, sand, silts, alluviums, loams. On clay, you just can't turn it upside down like that. And if you did, the subsoil would be horrible. You couldn't sow anything on it. Having turned it upside down, the Woodland Trust then tree planted large parts of that. And the trees have grown like billio, and there was a 95% take. So they're actually a bit too dense at the moment. And they've shaded out everything underneath. And in between and round the trees, various wildflower mixes were planted. Where they couldn't tree plant under the pylon line, obviously you've got a nice strip and various rides in the woodland. The advantage for the trees is that they get their roots straight down in the fertile area, but at the surface, wildflowers don't compete with young trees for water in the way that grass does. When you're tree planting, most of that effort of mulching and weeding around them is to keep the grass down because of the competition for water in those first vital 2 or 3 years. So soil inversion doesn't need any of that, doesn't need any mulching or any herbicides used. And consequently, the costs end up roughly the same as doing it in conventional manners. But it is only something for a big site and a suitable site. Or if there's any archaeological interest there, you can't do it because you'll destroy it. Have we lost Paul again? In that case, I'll have to carry on with the pond. One very good way of encouraging invertebrates is to have a pond. And that's a picture of adults because you have to be careful taking a picture of children, but children of all ages from 2 to 92 absolutely love ponds and pond dipping. This one is an artificially lined pond, which was dug by a JCB. We did try puddling it, the clay wasn't good enough to do it, and we've had to reline it, well, actually partly once and then completely a second time in since 1996, 1995 when we dug it. Because all sorts of things live in ponds, no fish, obviously, because they'd eat the invertebrates. We don't have fish in it. We do have a lot of smooth newts. Most of them have come in by themselves. We did bring the newts and we from various ponds that were being filled in. They were rescue animals. That was in 1998. And we did start it off with a couple of buckets of pond water from a well-established pond, which had got things like water fleas and water snails in them. It's a very good, that's the pond when it's in good condition. That's fairly soon after one of the relinings, so there is some blanket weed in there. That fades after a year or two. This one was filled partly by rainwater and partly by the fire brigade, who after we relined it kindly came in and gave us a dose of water for us. Plenty of shade there from water lilies and frog bits, plenty of plants underneath the water, some bare water areas for invertebrates to hunt and the newts to hunt and breed. And yeah, we have the dragonflies. The common darters just love those paving stones we dip from. They're forever going and sitting on them and basking. Makes them very easy to take a picture. Water beetles in the water. Therefore, the various smaller things they feed on, like mayflies and caddisfly larvae. And say smooth newts, which fascinate people. They're actually much better value than the other amphibians because we have the adults in from late April until about the beginning of July. But then the efts, the babies, are in all the way to September, and we're open to the public from May to September. And very good, obviously, for talking about food webs, predators and prey, and all the things you do with visiting school groups in the way of education. We haven't got Paul for this bit, but we've got several areas of coppice at the park. Now, there's a practicality there. The coppicing, it's run on a 6-year cycle, alternating with 3 coppice coops in the ancient woodland at Thornton Hough, part of Dimmonsdale, which Wirral Countryside Volunteers manage. And that coppicing on a 6-year cycle provides the hedge laying stakes that they need for their hedge laying activities. Thinner stuff goes off for bean poles and pea sticks as well. Coppicing does have great benefits for invertebrates. When it's opened up like that, then the wildflowers underneath, and we've got celandines that push themselves there. We've got wild garlic we've planted, some bluebells we've planted, some other species that are coming in, hart's tongue fern, which put itself in. And quite a few of those are good nectar and pollen plants, except for the fern, for the invertebrates, and particularly flourish in the year or two after the coppicing. Then as it goes up to that thicket stage, and most of the coppice is hazel, obviously there's shelter, there's a good place for birds, and the hazel itself starts flowering again after a few years, so there's some early pollen. That's the trimmings from the hedge and from the coppicing, what isn't of use for hedging stakes. And we get rather more of that we can cope with on this size plant. So once a year, we hire a chipper and chip it all up. And then when it's matured in the heaps for anywhere between 6 months and 18 months, it gets bagged up and again, sold off to people who like it for their gardens. And that again is taking nutrients off the site. As with the soil improver compost from the compost bins, it all takes nutrients off the site. Some of it gets used on my allotment and my friends' allotments, others to other allotment sets, other gardeners. We sell it for 50p a bag because it raises a little bit of money towards the chipping, but it's basically to get the nutrients off the site. And then there are the the fun things, which are at least as much for the people doing them as for the benefits to wildlife. A blown down tree, well, that's rotted at the bottom. One of our volunteers spent a long time drilling holes in it and made a bit of a bee hotel. The two slanting bits of woods are nailed on so that if we get any vandals on site, they can't easily put it to bits. If you look carefully, you can see some of the holes are blocked up with mud where the solitary bees have taken up residence. It does need to be in a sunny place for the bees. And there, of course, are the bug hotels. The Friends of Meadow Park in Aylesbury Port had great fun building that one. They are, of course, useful for things to shelter and hibernate in. The spiders and the earwigs and the wood lice and all that will be in there. And no doubt other insects go in there for hibernating. But it's as much to involve people and to show them the need of shelter as it is for the benefits to the wildlife. And finally, interpretation. So many people know so little about the little things that run the world, to quote Bug Life strapline. And there is a great need for education. You say bees to most people, they think honeybees. They don't think 26 species of bumblebee and somewhere over 200 species of solitary bee in this country. Not all of them up here, unfortunately. So obviously a good website, good Facebook page, whatever other social media you're used to using. There's still a place for paper leaflets like these. All right, some of that's industrial and history and the art trail, but the nature trail opens out to give people a map of the site and where to walk around and what to look on. We do have these on the website. We have QR codes on the park so people can download them onto their phones on site. But for family walking around, actually a piece of paper is easier to look at than a phone is. So now we're through we hope, the worst of the pandemic, we are bringing the paper leaflets out again for people to use. On-site display boards have their uses. We've increasingly gone to these, what were called lecterns. You undo 3 brass screws at the bottom and the perspex sheet slides out. And what's behind is just ordinary A3 paper sheets, laminated. We get them printed by a local firm very kindly, and they will last 3 or 4 years before the sun fades them. And the advantage is we can change them. So now for the lime waste, we've got some seasonal sheets, one for May, June, the other for July to September, just doing that for the acid grassland at the moment. And by the end of 3 or 4 years, you quite often want to modify them and change them anyway. So it's a good way of keeping your on-site interpretation up to date relatively cheaply, rather than an Armasil type fixed board, which lasts 10, 12 years and may outlast what you're really seeing. An unusual thing we've got is the art trail. Thank you, Carol Ramsey, for suggesting that one, and indeed masterminding the first one. That's one of her pieces. Yes, they are railway sleepers that make the bench of that. We wouldn't have thought of this if Carol hadn't approached us, but it's another good thing to talk about with guided groups when the sun ain't shining and so the flying insects aren't playing ball. We can use them and things to talk about it. Indeed, 2 of them are actually children's games. These are by Andrea Basil. The picture on the left is one of 55 from Old MacDonald had a butterfly park, on which he had 1 fern and 2 oak trees and 3 ladybirds, and it goes all the way up to 10 woodlice. And these are fixed up around the park. And the one on the right is from a domino trail, 16 dominoes, where you find one like that, and then you go and find the left-hand picture again on the next one, which will give you another new picture with it, and so on. These are invaluable on the when we have the cubs and the beavers and the guides and so forth, and the brownies around, often at 6 o'clock on an evening, when a lot of the flying stuff's gone to bed. And anyway, they don't want formal stuff. They've been in school all day. So we have them running around the park, finding all these tiles. And indeed, by July, they never do find all 10 woodlice. Keeps them occupied for ages, as well, of course, as doing the pond dipping. So be creative with your interpretation. Think of all sorts of different ways of doing it, formal and informal, because in the course of running around finding all those, they actually end up learning the names of those species. They don't realize they have, but they have. Right. Time for questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Hilary and Paul. That's been absolutely wonderful, and just thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experience tonight and giving so many really useful tips and really interesting sort of explanations of your methods as well, and it's such an impressive place in terms of the, you know, how small it is, but yet you've got such a number of different habitats and a really nice mosaic there. And I'd really recommend anybody listening tonight, if you're anywhere anything like local, it's really worthwhile going along yourself. And I know that we're fully booked on the sort of field visit associated with this webinar, but you can still add yourself to the waiting list for that. And is it still open on a Sunday, Hilary, in the main season?
It's open on a Sunday to public visits. No need to book or anything. From beginning of May to the middle of September. May the 1st is the opening day, when we have stalls all over the place. And this year, the Lord Lieutenant coming to do official opening of our new gates, which are very posh. So meant to be our 25th birthday present to ourselves, but thanks to the pandemic, it's now our 27th birthday present to ourselves. So that's a big day when it's not a good day to come and record the wildlife. There'll be people all over the place. But after that, every Sunday afternoon, 12 till 4, until the second Sunday in September. Guided groups we take at any reasonable time during the week. So any group that wants to get together, and that could just be half a dozen of you, get in touch. Easiest is to go to the Wirral Wildlife website and email through there. It's info@wirralwildlife.org.uk, but just Google Wirral Wildlife, part of Cheshire Wildlife Trust, and you'll find us. And it'll get passed on to us, and we'll sort out a guided visit with you.
Brilliant. And before I go into questions, I just wanted to mention a couple of species that we found during our recording day last year at the site, and just because there was just a couple of new to Cheshire beetles, never been found in Cheshire before, both of which were associated, Staphylinid beetles, predatory beetles, associated with the ant nest heaps there.
Yes, we have yellow meadow ants who make nice big hills. They were there when we arrived.
So one of those beetles is certainly associated with the ants because of its scientific name, which I won't be very good at reading out, but it's Myrmecophallus conicus. So it's definitely going to be an ant associated thing. But yeah, and for that species, there's only one previous record for the region, in North Lancashire. So yeah, and I'm sure that was also there was which I wrote in the chat. There was a chalcid wasp that attacks burnet moth pupae, and that was the day after someone found it Ashton's Flash in Northwich. But those are the first time that species had turned up in the region as well. So that was really nice. Anyway, I'll move on to some of the questions that people have written. I've got a list of them. So this is from Ruth Bennett, which has been, people have given input actually in the chat already, but can you recommend any sources for buying wildflower seed mixes?
Yes, several. I get asked this question so often. I have a little list in a document which I could get up. There are quite a few good wildflower seed merchants now, well established for several generations. We've unfortunately, of course, lost Landlife Liverpool, but recently we've used Naturescape. John Chambers is, I think, what Plant Life are using at the moment.
I think Naturescape was mentioned.
Yeah. I forgot the name's got out of my head now of the of one of the other ones, and I'm going to quickly see if I can actually hang on a moment. I've got a document with these things in if anybody wants me to email it to them. Suppliers. Okay. Emmersgate are one that's been established a very long time, good quality ones. Cheshire Wildlife Trust are using Fore seeds, FORE start seeds, which are grown in Shropshire, so the nearest firm to certainly South Cheshire.
I think
other
we
people,
are,
you know, other people doubtless have other ones that they know of, but those Naturescape, Emmelsgate, John Chambers 4-star to what I've dealt with in the last few years.
Great. I think we are able to email people that did book on to this. So if you are happy to share
Yep, I shall
list.
send. It's a sort of, because I do quite a bit of advising churchyards and community groups and all sorts of that things. I've got a sort of suppliers and document which I shall send over to Leanna.
Great, thank you, Hilary. Okay, I'll move on then to a question from Becky Belfin. Did you have to get an Environment Agency license to bring in and deposit the coal dust?
Well, we didn't. It was, I don't think so, because there was quantity wasn't big enough. It was only being, it was spread out, it was only an inch too thick. This is, admittedly, this is helpful. How many years ago is it?
About 2003, so it was about
20
tons.
Ben Chapman's still MP because he's the one who helped get the grant, and so it must be. And some of the present rules just weren't in place at the time. I think nowadays I would certainly at least ask the Environment Agency as to whether we would need it. But you know, going back to say nearly 20 years since we brought that in.
Right. Okay. Okay. Next question is from someone called Leaf. Do you have a species list for the site available anywhere?
And I think Leanne's already put into the chat where the invertebrate one is from their recording. We've got comprehensive plant records because I'm a botanist, so I can use that as a teaching site. So I can certainly send the plant list in, and everything, you know, the record, the Biological Records Centre for Cheshire Record hold all our records, so they have got them. So haven't actually got all the records in one place at the moment. It's some time since I asked Record to do us a complete species list for the site. I probably ought to ask them to do it again. But yes, look at Tanyptera 1 for invertebrates, and again I can send the plant list to anybody. I'll send that to Leanna as well.
Thank you, and Leaf, if you're listening, I think you're still here. Then, if you'd like to clarify your question, if you like, over what you were thinking of in terms of taxon specific species list, or was it, I don't know, just generally. But I'll move on to the next question anyway. Okay, this is from Rich P. Hilary, I have a south-facing bank that is grassy, slope about 30 to 35 degrees. I wish to plant for wildflowers. Do you recommend that I keep some of the grass to stabilize the slope, or remove it all, including the root mat?
I think if it's a slope like that, I would keep at least some of the grass. In fact, if you're, you know, I'd keep some bands of grass across it to stop the erosion, and clear some spaces to plant wildflowers in. If you can clear spaces and put seed in, but there's a bigger risk of the grass coming back and swamping them. Yeah, on a slope like that, yeah, you're quite steep at 30 degrees. I think I would keep some of the grass.
Okay. Thank you. Rich P, did you have any follow up on that at all? You're welcome to unmute yourself. Okay. Okay, well, I'll move on to the next question. Oh, excellent. Thank you, Hilary. Will do. That's fine. Thank you. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so question from Andrew Clark. Do you think the site is of local wildlife site selection status?
Oh, it is. It's been a local wildlife site for some years. Yes, Wirral is still calling them sites of biological importance, but that will change as the local plan goes through, which it is at the moment. Yes, it meets local wildlife site criteria as open mosaic habitat on previously developed land, which under the Cheshire criteria is one of the ones. It also, of course, has a good lot of educational use and public access use. But yes, it easily qualifies on butterfly species as well. we score enough points on the butterflies that are there to qualify. And that's before you start on the other invertebrates.
I imagine that was arranged quite early on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we did. We've had that state, I think, since the 1990 big revision of the local wildlife sites, or SPIs in Wirral, was, I think, when it got the status. I think it's 1990.
Wow. Okay.
So we no, it can't be that early. We haven't got the lease then. It must be the 1999 revision. And that will be when it will be. Yeah, because we only got the lease in 1993. It can't be before that.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about you're sort of always fighting the nitrogen deposition. What did you quote there per hectare per year? Was that?
For West Coast area around here, about 30 kilograms per hectare per annum.
Right.
Last I saw any figures for it, can be higher than that, of course, if you're downstream of a major road, or something like that.
Is that one of the major reasons why the dunes, say, of the Sefton coast, why they?
Well, it's a reason, although the dunes on the Sefton coast is about as clean as the rain comes, but it's never completely clear. It's a major problem for something like the heathlands in Holland and in the Netherlands, because they do reckon there that nitrogen deposition is what's making them lose heathlands, just because it's changing the soil. And we do notice on the public access heathlands in Wirral and Bidstone Hill in particular, where everybody takes their dog, that alongside the paths you get non-heathland species like ryegrass, just from the amount of nitrogen that's being deposited by dogs cocking their legs, and particularly if the owners do not clear up the feces after them. And this is a major problem. There's been some work recently published, and I can't remember exactly where, showing just how much this sort of deposition from dogs is affecting nature areas. And is another reason why dogs should really be kept on a short lead and kept apart, because at least it then restricts that nutrient deposition to a narrow zone and keeps it off the rest of it.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I presume you keep dogs off the butterfly park, do you?
We always have allowed dogs, but on short lead only. That is partly, obviously, where we are, and given the clientele, we don't actually want to ban dogs. Actually, our original founder had a dog, so this was always a bit difficult. But for the sake of the dog's safety, it's also there to keep on the paths, because that site was derelict for 25 years. And we've cleared a load of rubbish over the time we've had it. But underneath the trees and shrubs, I wouldn't guarantee there isn't a bit of sharp metal, a bit of sharp glass that a dog might not run under and cut a paw on. So we always tell the owners, for the dog's safety as well as for the wildlife safety, keep the dog on a short lead and on the paths.
Right. Okay. I'll read out this. I'm sure you can see it, but I'll read out this question from Chloe now in the chat. So, I have a local site which is species rich, but now has creeping thistle, nettle, and broadleaf dock growing frequently. Is there anything we can do in terms of more frequent cutting to save it?
Yeah, and I think she also puts that grazing isn't an option.
Oh, sorry.
Grazing is rarely an option in the urban area, let's face it. It has all sorts of problems, not least the safety of the grazing animals. You have to look carefully at what the species list is, because there will be good mileage in trying to do at least 2 cuts a year. So if it's like that clay grassland there, an April one that takes off the winter growth, because these days we've always got some winter growth, certainly in Wirral, where we're right on the right west coast, and then a long cut, and then possibly an aftermath cut in the autumn. So it would depend a little bit on what plant species you've got there, is because you don't want to chop off the heads of the main flowering ones. If there's not a lot of other flower, you say it's quite species rich, so presumably you have, you could actually cut it every couple of months for a few years. And the important thing is get those cuttings off and get them composted somewhere else. Ideally, if it's not too bad, you'll probably cut in late April, take the winter growth off, cut in somewhere around late July, early August, so you get the main growth off while it's still got a lot of nutrients in it. So effectively a hay cut. And then do a cut to mimic an aftermath graze somewhere around late September, October to take off the regrowth after the hay cut. And if you can manage those 3 cuts in the year, you've at least got some windows in between for things to flower and seed, and for your invertebrates to flourish. But it should help get the nutrients down gradually, because yeah, if nettle is getting in, your nutrients are too high. You want one nice patch where you dump some of the cuttings before you have nettle to grow, and then all the rest to keep getting them off. How many years like that? Well, that does depend on your soil. Patience, definitely. It's not going to be quick. But like anything else, the best time might have been to start 10 years ago, but the next best time is now.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Okay, so just going back to the chat, then there was a question from Sophie Randall. Very interesting talk, thank you. Would you say that seasonally changing interpretation boards are better for general education and engagement compared to ones that stay the same year round?
Yes, I would. It does depend a bit on your visitorship. I mean, we get quite a lot of repeat visits, particularly from the local families in the local area who can just walk up. So it's important for them to have something different each, at least twice a year. Because we close during the winter months, so we take the pictures out then. If you're a site that's open all year, it would be important to have stuff for the autumn winter as well. If you're the site where most people come and you come once a year, it maybe isn't so important. But yeah, I do like the seasonally changing ones. I think is very good. And again, it does encourage repeat visits. You can say, come back in 2 months' time, it'll be different.
Yeah, I think it's great, and particularly because it's a invertebrate focused management and the real seasonality that you get associated with that, don't you? So
yes, we sometimes have to explain to people that there are such things as seasons. Like the teacher who wanted to bring a group this week and meant to say, well, there won't be much out, not much flowering, not many insects out. I don't think she'd quite cottoned on to how seasonal things are.
No, that's great, and it's such a simple design that you use there, and actually makes it much cheaper as well to be able to keep changing it without having to, because they're pretty expensive, aren't they? Some of these installations.
Yeah, I mean the lecterns themselves, if you buy them in, they're not cheap. Yeah. We're looking at another one for the moment to replace our old industrial history board, which has fallen to bits, and again, so that we can put changing stuff in as we learn a bit more about the history of the site and the area. Because it's not just the railway, we've got brickworks as well, but that's another story. And you can buy ones in wood, or you can buy recycled plastic ones. So those at the moment are expensive; they're just over £1,000. But if you've got a good woodworker handy, they might well build you one. And the sheets are designed by one of our volunteers and printed by my son's firm, and then we laminate them. So it's very cheap to do the sheets. And the lecterns will last a good number of years, and we treat them with preservative or varnish or whatever, as they need it to make them last as long as possible.
Great, brilliant. Okay, a question from Sammy Martin. Hi, I'm a teaching assistant that helps my school's eco committee. The children have a vision and passion to create a wild corner on our school field. Mm. Have you any advice on how this area could be set up?
I presume you're not in Wirral, because otherwise I'd simply hand you over to our very good eco schools officer, Lynn Struve. Yes, now, schools, it's very good that a lot of them are going down this route now with some sort of area. And it does, of course, depend what area you've got. It would be a very good thing to have a mini hedge, a line of shrubs, a few trees at the back. You're South Staffordshire, right? Yeah, unfortunately, it's a bit too far to send Lynn to help you. So always, a range of flowering trees and shrubs, perhaps up against the perimeter fence, whatever you've got. we're all, it's easy care once your children love planting them. Once you've got them in, once they're established after 2-3 years, they don't need very much looking after, might need some coppicing or hedge laying or trimming back eventually. And then look in front of that as doing maybe an area of, a strip of rough grassland, which probably you can manage by just stopping mowing what's there already. And maybe some sort of wildflower area, but don't do Cornfield Annuals because there's so much work. And I'd think many times before putting a pond in, because they both a safety aspect and they do need a lot more looking after. My experience of ponds in school grounds is that they tend after a few years to be no good, particularly if the interested teacher moves on. But you certainly can do what my sister-in-law's school did, trees and shrubs of various sorts. You've got a fully mature hedge. Lovely. Well, just plant a few trees in front of it, scattered along. You've got your backdrop then. Make sure you've got flowering trees and shrubs. Have a band of rough grassland by that, and then see if you can manage to create a wildflower meadow of some sort. Add some tree trunks as rough seating so that you can take a class out, and if it's a bit damp on the ground, they can sit on the bits of tree trunk or any other seating you can arrange instead. Go with it. See how you can get on. Again, the children would like raising wildflowers from seed and planting them in. So you might choose to do your wildflower area that way rather than stripping and seeding, although kids also love scattering wildflower seed. The rotary one that I showed was done with getting the local, I think it was the Brownies, one of the uniformed organisations anyway, and they had their seed for that area, measured it out into a whole series of little plastic yogurt cups or something, mixed a bit of sand with it. And then each kid was more or less given a square metre to scatter that seed over, and the sand showed you where you've been. It's a lovely community activity. The kids love doing it. So go ahead with something like that. And there's lots of resources now available for schools for help the teachers actually using that sort of area. For our 50th birthday as Wirral Wildlife, we actually did, one of our committee members, Linda, put together a set of activities for each month. It's called Wirral's Wild 50. And if you go on the Wirral Wildlife website, you can find them all for downloading. And they've got loads of links in them there to all sorts of resources available from all sorts of other organisations, Woodland Trust, National Trust, as well as wildlife trusts and so forth. So wirralwildlife.org.uk and have a look for Wirral's Wild 50. Give you a good start on activities and how to do them.
Sounds good. Let's put a link to that in the chat then. Yeah, great advice for you there, Sammy. Great free advice. I think you could easily be a consultant here.
No, I've retired. I only do consultancy for people like community groups and schools and churches who actually want or need free advice because they can't afford to pay for it.
Superb stuff. Okay, so we have a question slightly early from Julie Mason. Did you do a survey of species before the reserve was open to measure improvements? Have you specifically planted plants to attract specific species?
Yes to both. One of the first thing we did when Mel Roberts got hold of me and said, come and see this derelict railway goods yard I lead next to. He was the person who inspired it all. First thing I did was a plant survey, and Liverpool Botanical Society came out and did some more plant work. Mel was already recording butterflies and moths, and we gradually accumulated a few other obvious things like bee records. We didn't, so this is going back to 1993, 3-4, before we actually opened the reserve in 1995. We didn't do a lot more than those obvious species. We hadn't got the contacts. The Tanyptera Trust wasn't around. So we was very much plants, butterflies, moths, bees, really, at that stage that we had knowledge on. And yes, we have planted in species to attract them. What Paul was talking about with the brimstones. Brimstones were breeding in Cheshire, breeding in Lancashire, not breeding on Wirral, and it was simply lack of food plant. because they only will eat alder buckthorn and purging buckthorn, and purging buckthorn likes lime in the soil, so there's very little of it in Cheshire, though we have planted it on the lime waste in the hedge. So we planted alder buckthorn and purging buckthorn, and other people on Wirral, Rangers, National Trust, Woodland Forestry Commission also planted the buckthorn species, and we now have brimstones breeding in several places in Wirral. We've brought in, we've strengthened the population of sheep sowl a lot. There was some sheep sowl there, but we've increased that a lot by planting. We've done quite a lot of planting of the hedgerow bottom species, primrose, stitchwort, red campion, that sells seeds copiously. There was already some Herb Roberts and Herb Bennett there. So, but we're a bit isolated from woodland. We're only down the railway track from Dibbinsdale, but it's a bit far for primrose to get. So we have planted in the woodland edge species along some of the hedgerows. On the lime waste, we did clear, basically we stuck the main path half up it, and then slightly more than half of it, we gradually cleared the grass off it because it had got quite grassy. And over several years, and with some help from a grant and some machinery, we gradually cleared the grass off. And we did sow half of that with what was then the land life calcareous meadow mix, which is actually where the cowslips came from. They've gone mad since by themselves. There were already oxeye daisies there. The mix brought in lady's bed straw and a few other species. So yes, we have. We're not too precious about the plants on the place. It's a right mixture because there's garden escape stuff from when it was derelict and stuff that probably came up the railway line when it was active, as well as stuff we've put in. That we'll plant plants if it's going to benefit the invertebrates, basically. According, we've got a management plan and we work to that.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, Chris Workman has just put in a reference that he had for dog mess affecting fertility from the Guardian there. So for those interested, you can click on that link. Leaf is asking, grazing animals on a site, good idea or not?
Getting out of our experience there, Paul, aren't we?
Yeah.
Because we're very much urban. It depends on your site. The one place in Wirral that's regularly using them is the National Trust has got part of the Thurston Common heathland grazed, and it's absolutely marvellous for helping keep that heathland in good condition, along with people cutting off the trees as well, because that's what would have happened, and various other techniques they've tried there. But having half a dozen Galloway cattle on there for the summer definitely does reduce the tree invasion. Now that's a specialist lowland heathland triple SI, it's a different side. In the early days, Mel did occasionally wonder about having grazing animals on the Butterfly Park. We weren't too sure they'd stay there very long, whether they'd end up in somebody's freezer. At the time, vandalism was quite a problem. Well, for one thing, a Butterfly Park, I think, is too small. We're only 2 hectares. It's not very big.
Is like intensive grazing ever good for invertebrates?
Really intensive grazing?
Probably not.
Probably only as a short-term thing if you really want to get your herbage down on an area that's gone a bit rough. I do remember Mel saying that before we got the park, somebody hobbled a horse on it for a bit had a tied to a stake in the middle, and that circle that the horse grazed did then come up when the horse was taken off with a nice lot of ragworts and other things. Ragworts, of course, being a very good nectar and pollen plant, as well as food plant for the specialist insects like the cinnabar moth. You really are getting out of my experience with grazing, though, because it's, as a very urban botanist, it's not something I ever had to handle. I would think that light grazing and focused grazing could be good, but you'd have to talk to somebody who knows about doing it, has experience of doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Hilary. And Leanna's put in that link there to the Wirral Wildlife, the 50 activity sheets page there. Okay. Well, I can't see any more questions in the chat at the moment. Oh, here we go. Okay, it's a question from Ho Yin Wong. is there a way to work around a small churchyard that is lacking wildflowers, which has several large trees that are protected so can't be cut? The problem is the trees take up too much water.
Yes, you're just going to choose the right plants. Yeah, obviously that will restrict both in the shade and the drought what will grow there. I would certainly, and I wouldn't be precious about it being totally natives either for that reason. Bulbs like daffodils, crocus, great hyacinth, they should probably establish all right and will probably be all right. At least I hope they're deciduous trees, but even if they're conifers, it's worth trying bulbs in there. And then look at some of the dry place plants that are quite shade tolerant. So perhaps things like herb Robert, bed straws, hedge bed straw, ladies bed straw. Ladies bed straw may want more sun than that, be worth trying. And possibly look at some of the spring stuff which will flower, particularly their deciduous trees, will do the normal trick of flowering first. Now, quite a lot of those, you could try bluebells. They probably will be all right, either the native or the hybrid. If you're in a churchyard, it may not matter which.
Does anything grow under you? I mean, what if they're yew trees?
No, nothing goes under you. No, I mean, that really is impossible. Even natural yew woods is down in that just don't have anything grow under you. That is a great problem. Yeah, I think have a good browse of some of the literature about what will be both drought and shade tolerant. It's a limited suite of species, but it should be possible to get some in. And deciduous trees, good, thank you. That makes life easier. So that, yeah, you could try some of your, certainly herb Bennett, herb Robert, red campion is quite drought tolerant. And all of these things that are flowering and basing leafing before the trees are in leaf. So when the trees aren't taking so much water up and when you haven't got the shade. So yeah, again, if you get in touch with me via email, I can probably think of a few more species than I'm thinking of the top of my head. But certainly there are ways you can do it. Some of the nettle leaf bellflower possibly be worth trying. Things like hedgerow cranesbill. So look at the woodland edge species, jack by the hedge garlic, which is food plant for orange tip butterfly, and the green vein white butterfly. That would probably take dry shade. So yeah, almost certainly best putting in by clearing some of the grass underneath and planting as plants, and keeping them watered until they're established. But do try it.
Great, thank you, Hilary. I hope that helps you. Ian, lots of more excellent advice. It's not that easy to scroll through the chat at the moment because there's just so many complimentary things. It's such a great.
I see somebody saying that they've done grazing on limestone grasslands, and the issue was getting a grazier who's happy to graze the sites. Well, that is definitely a genuine issue. The National Trust manager on Wirral, because the local farm at Oldfield Farm, Heswell, runs Galloways for beef, and they're happy to park 6 of their heifers on the National Trust heathland for the summer.
Yeah, so great if you can get them. Okay. Right, I don't think we've got any more questions now. Shall I just give a last opportunity? Anyone, you can unmute yourself. People used to talk more at the beginning of the pandemic. People were willing to sort of unmute themselves and speak as well, but people have got less. So it's quite interesting. But Emma, if you can.
Hi, yes, it was just in response to Ho Ying's question regarding what can grow when there's mature trees in a churchyard. What unfortunately is overlooked all too often is that they are vital ancient grasslands for fungi as well. So the yew trees do not prevent the growth of fungi, so you will still get vitally important fungi for conservation. So don't be disappointed that there's no flowers there. is that instead survey that cemetery for conservation status, waxcaps and earth tongues and species of the Chegg status, as he may well have there a cemetery that has, or churchyard that has an area that's of international importance, so very high status in conservation. So it's not all about flowers, and do remember the fungi as well.
Yeah, very good point, Emma. Yeah, churchyards can have very rich floras. I was asked to go out and look at St Peter's Delamere last year, and found that they're on, this is on the sand, obviously, just outside Delamere Forest, and it's only an early 19th century church. It's 220 years old or so, but part of their churchyard proved to have a nice acid grassland with typical acid grassland species. Now that in Cheshire is a real rarity now. So definitely before doing anything in a churchyard, do get a good survey to see what you've got. Plants, fungi, if you could got it, and any invertebrates you can cover as well. Because yeah, some churchyards are very boring, particularly in the urban areas, particularly if they had a lot of pollution during the time when we all burnt coal in our houses. But some of them can have very valuable habitats, and it's obviously important to keep those going. Remember another one around Delamere, St Peter's Sandyway, which turned out to have a nice piece of waxcap grassland as part of its churchyard. And of course there it was important to keep the right management going for the waxcaps. So yes, thank you, Emma. Yes, do look for the fungi.
Yeah, I've seen there's some great ones in South Cumbria. Violet coral fungus, I remember. Well, it's but I think so. To check in for fungi for wax caps is sort of from August, really, isn't it? August time.
Yeah, July, August, September.
They're quite early, aren't they?
Yeah,
You can get them as early as May, but yeah, the peak tends to be August, and then certainly September, October, and by middle of November, generally the frost has caused enough harm to fruiting bodies for them to disappear, but you'll still get them fruiting up until March. So there's only actually a very small window during a year where wax caps aren't present, but it's ignoring what the books say and getting to know your own site, because each site will fruit dependent on its own microhabitat. There's lots of reasons why that they vary their fruiting patterns, but certainly you should be checking from May right the way through until into the new year, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And there's, of course, hundreds of invertebrates that are completely reliant on fungi, that will only feed on fungi, particularly beetles and flies. Many groups that make full use of it. Okay. Is there anything else? Does anyone got anything else for Hilary and Paul then, before we say good night? It's been a fabulous evening, really interesting, and such really comprehensive and full answers to everything. Real wealth of knowledge. We're lucky to have you both tonight. And yeah, sorry, Paul, you had technical problems this evening, but Hilary did a very good job of filling in.
Yeah, I'm sure she did.
Well, fortunately, we'd practiced it, so I'd heard what Paul was going to say. So I was really only the coppicing bit I would have liked to have Paul in, but I didn't know what he was going to say.
But yeah, it's been great, and you can see that as well from all the comments in the chat. So it's been we really appreciate you doing this for us tonight, and for the audience, we hope to see you again soon. We hope that there's still people here now who are going to be coming in May as well to actually visit the site and learn even more. Yeah. So and the opening day is the 1st of May, you said, isn't it?
1st of May is the opening day, which is the big one with stalls everywhere and activities going on and so forth. It's our money raiser, big plant sale for Wirral Wildlife with garden plants and house plants. But if you're more interested in looking at the wildlife, come the Sundays after that.
Okay.
We do have a spider stall that day, Hilary.
We do, yes. John McGaw's bringing his
John
spider stall.
McGaw's
So
comes and collects spiders on site, and he shows it to people.
yeah,
Okay,
so you can learn to identify spiders if you don't know already.
Yeah.
great. And what time does that start?
It runs 11 till 4.
11 till 4. Great. And also it's right next to, well, you've shown it in the old pictures, but it's right next to the train station, isn't it, this site?
It's right next to Bevington Station on the Merseyrail Wirral line, and there are bus routes that core at the bottom of the road. So public transport routes are good.
Yeah, really, really accessible site.
And you can bring him, you can cycle there, and we've got some cycle stands.
Great. There we go.
Paul's a great cyclist, so we have that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I'll look forward to going again. Yeah, really enjoyed my couple of visits I've been. Need to go more. But yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much again, and yeah, see you all again very soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.